Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is SpellRogue. So this is a deck builder technically, but it's using a bit of a different set of mechanics than usual, in the case that you don't necessarily have a deck of cards, but rather you have a hand of spells that are sort of represented as cards, and most of everything is done via rolling dice. The way that it starts out is you choose a character, and at first you'll only have the one character available, the Water Mage, but eventually you'll unlock an Earth Mage and a Fire Mage as well. Each character also has 4 different starting sort of loadouts that you can choose, and at first you'll only have one of them unlocked, but as you level up that character by using them through multiple runs, you'll unlock the other loadouts that they can start with. Every character starts with a hand of 3 spells, and as you complete various bits on the map, then you will unlock more spells, as well as, potions and artifacts and things like that as well, to sort of create your build throughout that particular run. You do have the classic node-based map where you'll go from battles to elite battles to camps to rest and some other places like that, although in this case they're not exactly a camp, they're more of like a stone circle, but the idea is the same. Eventually ending in a final boss for that particular area and then moving on to the next area until you get to the third area, which is a big sort of abyssal plain where some really horrible things wait for you and the final boss waits at the end. Once you actually beat the game for the first time, you start to unlock these extra difficulty modes, which will give you more experience for the characters that you're actually playing, so you'll be able to unlock stuff faster, but each one adds a sort of random list of extra considerations, various different things that will make that run harder and harder. And of course, as you beat the level 1 version of this, then you'll unlock the level 2 version, which will have double the number of modifiers, and it'll just keep going like that until you have incredibly difficult runs later on. So once you get into battle, the main meat of the game, you'll notice that you roll a bunch of dice, and usually you start with about 3 dice that you'll actually roll. And you do not actually draw in this game. You don't draw spells or have a deck of any sort. You have a hand of spells, and they're always all available at once. Every spell has a cost for playing it up at the top of its card, as well as a number of charges that limit how many times you can use that spell per turn. These charges always refill back to full at the end of the turn unless otherwise stated. There are some spells that have sort of purple charges that do not refill until the battle is over. And so you're meant to use the dice that you roll to actually cast these spells. And you'll notice that there are all kinds of different costs for these spells, and the main idea is that you want to build a hand of spells that are castable with a wide variety of possible dice, because you never know what you're going to get, so whatever you roll, you want to be able to have something useful to do. And it does use the classic sort of Slay the Spire intent system, where an enemy will have what they're about to do above their head so that you can plan ahead. And every character starts with 3 spells, but you have a couple of extra slots for more, and every time you beat a combat, you'll get to choose one of 3 spells as a reward, and spells do have rarities as well. Oftentimes, higher rarity spells are not better than lower rarity spells. In fact, I've found some of the most useful spells have been of white normal rarity, but you get like greens and blues and stuff too, and those are usually a lot more specialized. They're generally really good if you have a specific build that is meant to use them, but the lower rarity spells are generally your more useful everyday kind of bread and butter spells. Now, I mentioned that every character starts with 3 spells, and this is important because they sort of represent the 3 archetypes of spells that you're going to be looking for. You start with an offensive spell, of course, because you got to be able to deal damage. You also start with a defensive spell that will usually give you some sort of armor, or like a shielding of some kind. And then you start with a dice manipulation spell, and this is super important because, as I've mentioned in other games that use dice are an inherently random fixture of a game like this, which means you gotta do something to be able to mess with RNG a little bit, or else it starts to feel unsatisfying because the player can simply roll badly and then get screwed in a way that doesn't feel like it's their fault. So if you're going to use dice as a major central game mechanic, you've got to have ways for the player to manipulate those dice to their favor. And this game does it by giving every character a different dice manipulation spell that they'll start with. And every different character loadout that you can pick of the 4, they also usually start with a different one too. So the character has several different possibilities depending on which loadout you choose. And you'll also find even more of them as rewards. You can sometimes come across other manipulation spells as you go. And these can be all sorts of different things, from simply returning the dice that you put into them, but with one number higher. So you put a 4 into it and it gives you a 5. Maybe it instead eats up the dice but rolls 2 different dice of a lower value, or maybe one that flips the die over to its opposite value. So if you put in a 3, it becomes a 4, or if you put in a 1, it becomes a 6. There are loads and loads of different spells that are meant specifically to hook into the RNG and make it feel less random and give you a lot more tactical control over what you actually have to work with, because what you roll is very rarely what you're actually going to use entirely. A lot of those are going to be modified in some way to better suit what you need. That means this game as a whole feels really, it makes you feel smart when you actually manage to do a battle in such a way that you don't take any damage or you just do it really efficiently. You feel really smart because there's a lot of tactics under the hood here when it comes to understanding what you've just rolled and how best to use it, and also what you might need to change of what you rolled to be able to use it better. As for the way the costs work, you'll find some require a specific number or they won't work at all, so it might need a 3 and won't accept anything other than a 3. And then there are others that have a range, let's say 1 to 4, so you can pick anything from a 1 to a 4 to use it, and some of these will change their effects based on the number that you actually pay for it with. Like maybe it gives you that number of armor, but some of them maybe don't actually change their effect. So it's a good idea to actually pay for them with the cheapest dice possible so that you can use the more expensive stuff for other things. And then there are some spells that actually get a better effect the more dice you use to pay for them. So you actually want to be inefficient and deliberately pay for it with as many dice as possible so that it gets powerful. There are even some spells that need multiple dice on purpose. It'll say 2 even, so you actually have to have 2 even numbers rolled to pay. And then you'll also see some costs that are a number surrounded by asterisks, and these are countdown dice. These, when you put a die into it, it subtracts that number from the countdown, and it casts once it reaches 0. And it stays that number between turns, so you can pay for it through multiple turns in order to cast it later. But of course, the costs aren't the only thing you've got to consider. You've also got to consider the number of charges. Every spell has a specific number of charges, and this is to make sure that you can't just spam something, although it is possible to refill the charges above their normal maximum to get some extra uses out of them, depending on what spells you have. There are actually some spells that are specifically meant to give more charges to other spells. And of course, all the while, as you're using all these strategies to try and figure out how you want to beat the enemies, you've got to be defending yourself from their attacks and stuff too, so you got to have some good defensive options. Building armor is extremely important. There's also sometimes some limited healing, although most of the healing in this game comes from finding those stone circles, so you're not going to get a lot of healing in this game. In fact, even beating a boss and moving on to the next floor doesn't heal you back to full. It's only a 50% heal. I should also mention, of course, that the spells that you can draw from every time you beat a battle are based on the character you're playing. So if you're playing the water mage, then you're going to get water spells. So you could say that each character has their own sort of library of possible spells that they can find, but there are also void spells, which are purple, and every character can find these, although they're pretty rare, and they're usually only found as rewards for specific events, oftentimes events where you have to sacrifice something in order to get one of them. But they all have their own theme, and they're very powerful, and most void spells have just really strong effects in general and are very much worth having if you can work them into your hand. You'll also notice that every element kind of has its own set of different mechanics. Like water has a lot of dice manipulation, a lot of very efficient armor, the building of certain self-buffs and stuff. Earth has a lot of very expensive, slow offensive options that are very powerful, but they just take a while to go off. But of course, a lot of defensive options because, hey, it's Earth. And then Fire is very aggressive with tons of offensive options, and usually a fair number of debuffs and stuff that you can afflict enemies with as well, although their defensive pool is a little bit less advanced than the other classes and is more based around very temporary effects and stuff like that, so you got to be careful and have usually a high aggression playstyle to do a fire elemental run. You'll also come across loads of different artifacts, passive items that you can gather to make yourself stronger. You'll find these sometimes as a reward for things like elite battles. You'll also find one at the very beginning of a run, and you'll be able to buy them at shops as well with in-game gold. These can be pretty useful, and they're generally something that you want to have to sort of accentuate your build, as is usually the case with passive items in a deck builder like this. And you can also find these other kinds of spells that take up their own slots. You'll only find 2 of these in a run, one on the second floor and one on the last floor. These are super powerful effects, but they do not cost dice in order to cast. Instead, they have a timer, and you can only cast them once the timer is full. So usually they're only castable turn 3 or more, although some can go turn 2. And I know of at least one that actually starts the battle charged and rolls a couple of extra low-value dice for you. But they're really strong, and they're nice to have. I especially like the one that adds a cumulative +5 to the damage of any offensive spell that you have. So you can use it on the spell that you find you're casting the most and just get 5 and then 10 and then 15, and it just keeps going up from there for that battle, but it does reset at the end of the battle. It's super good against elites and bosses. Another really important thing would be the shards. You'll find 1 shard for free on the first floor, but the rest of them during a run you've got to get usually from elite battles, and shards are sort of like upgrade stones. You can use them to either unlock more slots so that you can make your hand of spells bigger, because by default it's 5, but you can get up to 7. Or you can also use it to upgrade a spell. The 3 spells that a character starts with cannot be upgraded, but every other spell that they find during a run can. You'll see these 2 little gem symbols around the center of a spell's card, and those represent 2 different upgrades, and these are mutually exclusive. You can only choose one of the 2. So once you upgrade a spell once, that's it. It's fully upgraded. You can't get the other one, but they're both usually really powerful upgrades. They are things that you definitely want, and depending on what sort of build you're going for, they can make certain spells extremely powerful and highly useful, depending on what you're doing with them. So I definitely recommend getting as many shards as possible, because it's just, the game gets really hard by the late 2nd and 3rd floors, and I really recommend having like a fully upgraded arsenal of spells in order to be able to actually make it through the later parts of a run. So you really probably should be doing as many elite battles as possible early on so that you can get a ton of shards. There's a fair amount of meta progression, some stuff that you can unlock. You can, of course, unlock the new characters, and there are also tomes of spells that allow you to unlock new spells for you to find in a run. These work in a couple of different ways. The new spells and stuff like that are actually unlocked via challenges. If you look through the books, you'll find there are all sorts of different challenges that you can complete, and once you actually complete them, you'll unlock a new spell or even a new artifact, and you can look at them at any time to see what you might need to do. And the other unlocks, the new characters and new books, as well as the new loadouts for each character, are unlocked by gathering these golden dice thingies. And you get these by doing a couple of different things. Basically, every time you meet like a major progression milestone, you get one of these dice, like leveling up a new character or completing a run with each different character loadout and things like that. So you have quite a bit of stuff to unlock as it stands right now in order to make the game more varied as you go on. Overall, I'd say so far it's a really, really solid deck builder. I've really enjoyed its focus on variety, as well as its really nice art style. It's nice and colorful and stylized and then quite pleasant looking. And just the general tactics of combat feel really satisfying to do. You know, achieving an efficient battle where you don't take damage just feels really good in this game because of how much sort of tactical variety there is, and of the idea of rolling dice and having to manipulate them to make them more useful to you and all that stuff. There's a lot of layers going on in the combat here, and it makes it really fun. As far as the early access goes, I haven't noticed any like major deficits, like any sort of huge bug problem or anything like that. It seems to work pretty well. It's actually very polished in my opinion. The only thing that I would say that it really needs more of would be variety in terms of stuff like void spells, and just more spells in general is always useful, even though there's actually quite a bit already. But I would really like to see more variety in enemies, especially elites and bosses. A lot of times, elites especially are kind of like puzzle fights, and it makes them really interesting and pretty enjoyable to do, so I would definitely like to see more of that sort of thing, and I think the game would benefit heavily from having, you know, maybe 3 or 4 different possible bosses per floor. That would be a lot. Considering there are only 3 floors, that would help a lot, I think, with run variety. It's pretty cheap and cheerful right now too, which is nice. Considering there's a lot of quite polished content on offer here, I would say it's most definitely worth getting into. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for SpellRogue if you wish to check it out. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.